The Whitmore estate had 30 rooms, a marble staircase, and a dining hall built to make small people feel smaller. And on the night of the engagement dinner, everyone at that long table had already decided that Clara Bennett did not belong in the room. She was 24. She wore a plain pale blue dress she had ironed twice, and she kept her hands in her lap so no one would see them shaking. Daniel sat beside her, holding her hand under the table. "Just be yourself," he whispered. "They'll love you." Across the table, his mother, Vivian, smiled the way a knife smiles. "So, Clara," Vivian said sweetly, loud enough for the whole table, "tell everyone, what exactly does your family do?" Clara's throat went dry. I don't have family," she said quietly. "I grew up in the county care system. I work as a nurse's aide." Ashley, the sister, laughed into her wine glass. "A nurse's aide? So you clean up after old people for money?" "Ashley." Daniel's voice was sharp, but his mother raised one hand and the table went quiet. "Let's not pretend," Vivian said. "My son is going to inherit everything this family has built, and he wants to marry a girl with no name, no money, and no people." "It's not cruelty, dear. It's arithmetic." A woman down the table leaned to her neighbor and whispered, not quietly enough, "I heard she met him at the nursing home. Imagine, a gold digger who smells like a hospital." Clara heard it. She was meant to hear it. But she thought about the people she cared for, the ones who could not feed themselves. And she decided that smelling like a place where people were kept alive was not something she would ever apologize for. "Do you even know which fork to use?" Ashley asked, smirking. "Or do they not teach that where you're from?" Clara set down her fork. "No," she said quietly. "Where I'm from, they teach you not to make a stranger feel worthless at her own engagement dinner. I suppose we all learn different things." For half a second, nobody spoke. Even Vivian blinked. The poor girl in the cheap dress had a spine, and that was not in the script. Clara looked down at her plate. She had promised herself she would not cry in this house. Not tonight. And that was the moment Richard Whitmore, Daniel's father, a man who had not spoken all evening, finally looked up from the head of the table. His eyes moved across Clara's face, past her nervous smile, and stopped. They stopped on the small silver locket resting against her collarbone. The wine glass slipped from Richard's fingers and shattered across the floor. Every head turned. Vivian froze. And Richard stood up so fast his chair fell backward. His face had gone completely white. "Where?" he said, and his voice was not the voice of a powerful man anymore. "Where did you get that necklace?" But before you decide who deserved to be humiliated at that table tonight, you need to know what that locket was. And you need to know the name of the woman everyone in this family had spent 30 years trying to forget. Stay until the end, because the answer changes everything you think you just saw. To understand that locket, you have to go back 4 months, to a place with no marble staircase at all. Fairview County Care Home was a low gray building at the end of a bus line, where the state sent old people that nobody came to visit anymore. Clara had worked there since she was 19. She fed people who could no longer lift a spoon. She sat with them when the fear came at night. The pay was almost nothing. But Clara had grown up with nothing, and she understood something the Whitmores never would, that being forgotten hurts more than being poor. In room 14, there was a woman named Margaret Hale. Margaret was 78. She had no children on her visitor list, no flowers on her windowsill, and a mind that was sharper than the whole staff put together. Most aides avoided room 14 because Margaret asked hard questions and did not accept easy lies. Clara went there on every break she had. They talked about books, about cities Margaret had seen, about the war she had survived. But Margaret never talked about her own past. Not really. Until one afternoon in March, Clara found her at the window, holding a small silver locket, turning it over and over in her thin fingers. "Do you know what the worst kind of theft is, Clara?" Margaret asked. "It isn't when a man takes your money. It's when he takes your name and puts it on the thing you built." Clara didn't understand it then. She thought it was just an old woman remembering. She didn't know she was hearing the first sentence of a 30-year-old crime. There was a rhythm to Clara's life that no one in a mansion would ever recognize as happiness. But it was. She woke at 5. She took 2 buses. She spent her days lifting people who could not lift themselves. And she came home to a one-room apartment where the radiator knocked all night, like something trying to get in. She had learned young that if she waited for someone to take care of her, she would wait forever. So she took care of other people instead. It was the only thing that had ever made her feel like she was worth something. Margaret saw that in her before Clara saw it in herself. "You give and give," Margaret told her once, "and you never once check whether the world is giving back. That will either destroy you, child, or it will save you. I have not decided which." Every afternoon, Margaret told Clara a little more. About a hardware shop. About long nights drawing designs at a kitchen table. About a partner she had trusted with everything. But she never said the partner's name. Every time she got close, she stopped, and her hand went to the locket. As if the name still had the power to cut her, even now. "One day you'll understand why I don't say it," Margaret told her. "Some names you keep locked up, because saying them out loud is how they get to hurt you again." Clara understood that better than Margaret knew. Clara had a name she never said either. The name of the mother who left her at a fire station at 3 days old. Maybe that is why the two of them fit. A woman erased at the end of her life, and a girl erased at the start of hers. Sitting together in room 14, holding on to each other in a building the world had forgotten. Sometimes Margaret's mind would sharpen suddenly, and Clara would catch a glimpse of who this woman must have been. One afternoon, a nurse couldn't get the medication cart's wheel to stop sticking. Margaret watched for a minute, then told her exactly which bolt was loose and why. She was right. "I used to build things," Margaret said, almost to herself. "Real things. Things people used every day and never thought about. That is the best kind of work. The kind nobody notices because it just works. And then a man decided the world would rather see his face than my drawings. And he was right. That is the part that still hurts. He was right." Clara didn't fully understand those words then, but she remembered them. And months later, standing in a courtroom, she would finally understand exactly what Margaret had built, and exactly who had taken it. That same spring, in a completely different world, Clara met Daniel. He came to Fairview to donate through his company's charity program. A photo opportunity, really, arranged by his mother's public relations team. The cameras wanted him shaking hands with smiling seniors. Instead, Daniel found a young aide on the floor of the hallway, holding a frightened man who had fallen, telling him softly that he was safe. He knelt down and helped without being asked. The cameras loved it. Clara didn't even notice them. They started talking. Then they started meeting. Daniel had never met anyone who wanted nothing from him. Not his money, not his name, not a single thing except his company. On their third meeting, he took her to the most expensive restaurant in the city to impress her. She was quiet the whole time, and afterward she asked him a strange question. "Do you know the name of the man who parked your car tonight?" Daniel didn't. Clara did. She had asked him on the way in. His name was Victor, and he had a daughter starting college. Daniel realized, sitting in that restaurant, that he had spent his whole life being served by people he never once saw. "You see, people," he told her that night. "Nobody in my whole life has ever just seen people." He fell in love with her right there, and he never really recovered from it. For those 3 months, Daniel started meeting Clara at Fairview after her shifts. He met the old people she cared for. He even met Margaret once, though neither of them knew what that meeting would one day mean. Margaret had studied Daniel's face for a long moment that day, the way she studied everything. Then she'd said something odd to Clara after he left. "That boy has kind eyes, but kind eyes can come from hard families. Watch how he stands when his mother speaks." For 3 months, it was the happiest secret of his life. And then he made the mistake of telling his parents he had found the woman he wanted to marry. Vivian Whitmore ran a background check before dinner was even cleared from the table. An orphan, a cleaner in a nursing home. She set the report down like it smelled bad. Daniel, sweetheart, this is not a wife. This is a liability with a pretty face. You don't know her, Daniel said. I don't need to, Vivian answered. I know her type, and I know exactly how these stories end. What Vivian did not know was that her own husband, Richard, had gone very quiet in his study that night, because Daniel had mentioned one small detail. The girl always wore a locket, silver, old, shaped like 2 hands holding a rose. Richard told himself it meant nothing. There were thousands of lockets in the world. But he did not sleep that night. And a man like Richard Whitmore did not lose sleep over nothing, because 30 years ago, he had held a locket exactly like that one in his own hand. And he had watched the woman who owned it walk out of his life with nothing. Vivian Whitmore did not fight wars she could lose. She fought them quietly, with money, before anyone knew a war had started. 2 days after the background check, a black car pulled up outside Clara's tiny apartment. Vivian did not get out. She simply lowered the window and told Clara to get in. Inside, she slid an envelope across the leather seat. $50,000, she said. You leave tonight. You don't say goodbye. You send Daniel one text saying you were never serious. Clara looked at the envelope for a long moment. It was more money than she had ever seen. It could have changed her whole life. No, she said. And she opened the car door and stepped back out into the cold. Vivian's smile finally cracked. You stupid girl, she said. I offered you the easy way. Remember that, because I always win, and I am never this polite twice. That night, Vivian moved to her second plan without a flicker of hesitation. She invited Sophia Vance to dinner. Sophia was beautiful the way a bank statement is beautiful. Flawless, cold, and impressive only if you cared about the number underneath. She sat beside Daniel and touched his arm, and talked about the yacht her father had just bought. Isn't she perfect? Vivian said to Daniel afterward. Sophia understands this world. She would never embarrass you. Marry her and Hale Tower closes, and this family is untouchable for another generation. I don't love her, Mother, Daniel said. I love Clara. Love. Vivian said the word like it was a childish thing. Your father loved someone once, too. Look how well that turned out. Love is what poor people call the thing they have instead of options. Daniel didn't answer. But he noticed something that night. The way his mother's hands shook when the word Hale Tower came up. The way his father left the room whenever the deal was mentioned. Something in his family was rotten, and it was older than Clara. He just didn't know how much older yet. Meanwhile, the clock kept moving. Investors flew in. Lawyers worked through the nights. Hale Tower had a hard deadline, and everyone in the Whitmore world could feel it pressing down like weather before a storm. In a glass boardroom at the top of the city, Richard sat across from the investors, and for the first time in years, he was not the most powerful man in the room. 72 hours, Whitmore, one of them said, tapping the table. The paperwork is clean. The land is clear. Nothing can stop this unless a ghost climbs out of your past. There aren't any ghosts, are there? Richard said no. He said it smoothly, the way he had said 1,000 comfortable lies. But that night, he opened the drawer where he had kept Margaret's locket for 30 years and found it empty. He had sent it away years ago, and now, somewhere in the city, it had come back to life on the neck of a girl his son wanted to marry. He told himself it was a coincidence. He was very good at telling himself things. It was the one skill that had never failed him. It was about to fail him completely. But here is what Clara did not know, and what Daniel did not know either. The Whitmore family was broke. Not on paper. On paper, they were magnificent. But Richard had over-leveraged everything on a single deal. a massive property development called Hale Tower. Yes, Hale Tower. He had even named it after her, the way a guilty man sometimes builds a monument to the person he wronged and tells himself it is an honor. The deal would close in 72 hours. If it closed, the family was saved. If anything spooked the investors, any scandal, any lawsuit, any old ghost, it would collapse and take the entire Whitmore fortune down with it. So Vivian had a second plan, in case the money ran out. His name was money too. His name was Sophia Vance. Sophia was the daughter of the biggest investor in Hale Tower. If Daniel married Sophia, the two fortunes merged and the whole house of cards would stand. Vivian had been arranging it for a year. And now, 3 months before that plan paid off, her son had walked in with a penniless orphan and a wedding date. This is why the dinner mattered so much. It was never really about Clara's dress or her job or her manners. It was a business emergency wearing the mask of a family dinner. Vivian needed Clara gone before the ink dried on Hale Tower. And Daniel, caught in the middle, kept making the one promise that would cost him the most. "I'm not leaving her," he told his mother. "I don't care what it costs." "It will cost you everything," Vivian said quietly. And for once, she was telling the truth. That night, Clara told Daniel about the $50,000. She had almost not told him. She didn't want to be the reason his family broke apart. But she had promised herself she would never keep a secret from the man she was going to marry. Daniel went white with anger. "She offered you money to leave me?" "Daniel," Clara said, "I need you to hear the important part. I said no, not because of you, because I'm not for sale." Daniel took both her hands. "It's the reason I'm going to marry you, even if it costs me every dollar my family has," he said. "That money was always going to run out. You never will." Meanwhile, Daniel had quietly started asking questions. He pulled old company records, and he found a name that appeared on the earliest documents and then simply vanished, as if someone had been carefully erased. A name he did not recognize. Hale. Back at Fairview, Margaret Hale was getting weaker. The staff had started using the word soon. But Margaret was not afraid of soon. She was only afraid of leaving one thing undone. One afternoon, she took Clara's hand and pressed the silver locket into it. "I want you to have this," she said. "Wear it. Don't take it off. Not for anyone." Clara laughed gently. "Margaret, this looks valuable. You should give it to your family." Margaret looked at her for a long time. "You are the only person who ever visited me," she said. "You are my family. And one day this locket is going to tell you a story. When it does, don't be afraid of it." The afternoon before the dinner, Clara sat with Margaret one last time. She was nervous about meeting Daniel's parents, and Margaret could see it. "Rich families have a game they play at dinners," Margaret told her. "They ask you what your people do, not because they care, because they already know the answer, and they want to watch you say it out loud." "When they do that," Margaret said, taking Clara's hand, "don't shrink. Don't apologize for being poor. Poverty is not a sin, child. Cruelty is. And the person who makes you feel small is always the one who is small." Clara laughed nervously. "You sound like you've sat at a table like that before." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I sat at one, a long time ago," she said. "And I let them make me feel small. I have regretted it for 30 years. Don't make my mistake. Whatever happens at that dinner, you keep your head up. Promise me." Clara promised. She had no idea she was promising it to the very woman whose story was about to explode across that dinner table like a bomb 30 years in the making. That same week, something had begun to shift in Daniel, too. He loved his family, but he had started to notice the cracks. The whispered phone calls, the lawyers coming and going, the word Hale Tower, spoken like a prayer and a curse at the same time. One night he asked his father directly, "What is Hale Tower, really? Why does everyone go quiet when I say it?" Richard had looked at his son for a long moment and then lied. "It's just a big deal, son. Big deals make people nervous." It was the last lie he would ever get away with. Clara put it on. She wore it to work. She wore it home. And 2 weeks later, she wore it to the Whitmore engagement dinner, with no idea she was walking into the middle of a war that had started before she was even born. Which brings us back to that broken wine glass, and Richard Whitmore standing white-faced at the head of his own table, staring at a locket he thought he would never see again. "Where did you get that necklace?" he said again, louder. Clara's hand rose to it without thinking. A woman gave it to me," she said, "at the care home where I work. Her name is Margaret." The name landed in that dining hall like a stone through glass. Richard reached for the table to steady himself. "That's impossible," Vivian snapped, standing now too. "Richard, sit down. She's a con artist. She researched us. This is a performance." But her voice had a crack in it, because she had never seen her husband afraid of anything. "Margaret Hale," Richard said slowly, ignoring his wife completely. Is she still alive?" Clara's eyes filled. "Barely," she whispered. "The doctors say it's a matter of days. She has no one. That's why She stopped, because Richard had sat down hard and put his face in his hands. Looked at her brother. Daniel looked at his father, and for the first time all night, nobody at that table was looking at Clara like she was the problem. Vivian saw the whole room slipping and did the only thing she knew. She attacked. "Enough theatrics. Whoever this Margaret is, she is a stranger. Clara stays away from this family. The wedding is off. Richard, tell them." But Richard was not listening. He was looking at Clara's locket, and something was breaking in him that money had held together for 30 years. "Open it," he said quietly. "The locket. Has anyone ever opened it?" Clara shook her head. "It's stuck. Margaret said it had been closed for a very long time." Richard walked the length of that long table, past his shocked wife, past his silent son, and knelt down in front of a nurse's aide in a pale blue dress. A billionaire, kneeling. With trembling fingers, he pressed a spot on the side of the locket that no one else knew was there. And it clicked open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph. 2 young people, laughing, standing in front of a small hardware shop. A young woman with kind eyes, and a young man who was unmistakably Richard Whitmore. For a moment, Richard was not in that dining hall at all. He was 26 again, standing outside a hardware shop with paint on his hands and his whole life ahead of him, next to the smartest person he had ever met. The photograph had been taken the day they signed their first lease. Margaret had been so happy she cried. He had spent 30 years and $100 million building monuments to himself, and none of them had ever made him feel the way that one cheap photograph did. Like a man who had once, briefly, been good. Vivian leaned in to look, and her face changed. "Who is that woman with you?" she demanded. "Richard, who is she?" Richard closed his eyes. "She's the person," he said, "who actually built everything you think I built." Vivian's mind was already racing ahead of everyone else in the room, because Vivian was the only one who understood what this meant in numbers. If Margaret Hale was alive, if there was proof, then Hale Tower was not just a building. It was a crime scene with her family's name on the deed. "This girl planned this," Vivian said, her voice climbing. "She found some dying woman, she learned our history, and she wore that necklace into my house to blackmail us. It's a scheme, Richard. It's extortion." But Clara was crying now. Not the tears of someone who had won, but the tears of someone who had just learned that a woman she loved had been robbed of her whole life. "I didn't even know your last name until Daniel said it 3 weeks ago," she whispered. "I don't want your money. I never wanted anything from any of you." And that was the sentence that broke the room. Because everyone at that table could hear that it was true. Ashley, the sister who had laughed into her wine an hour ago, was staring at Clara now with something else on her face. Ashley had spent her whole life being taught that people like Clara were beneath her. And for the first time, watching this poor girl cry for a stranger, she wondered if she had been taught the exact opposite of the truth. Daniel knelt beside Clara. "We're going to fix this," he said. "Whatever my father did, we are going to make it right." He didn't look at his mother when he said it. He didn't have to. The war lines in that family had just been redrawn, right there, over a broken wine glass and an open locket. The guests understood, the way rich people always understand when a house is no longer safe to be seen in, that it was time to leave. Within 20 minutes, the dining hall was empty except for the family, and Clara, and the truth now sitting in the middle of the table like an uninvited guest who would never leave again. Richard turned to Clara, and there was something desperate in his eyes now. "Tell me about her," he said. "Margaret, is she comfortable? Does she have what she needs? Is anyone with her?" "She has me," Clara said. "That's all she's had for years, a nurse's aide on her lunch break. You could have found her any time in 30 years, Mr. Whitmore. She wasn't hiding. She was just poor. And poor people are very easy to not look for." That sentence hit Richard harder than any lawsuit ever would. Because it was not an accusation. It was just true. He had not looked for Margaret because looking would have meant admitting what he had done. And it was easier to build a tower with her name on it than to knock on her door. "Take me to her," Richard said suddenly, standing. "Tonight. I have to say something to her before." But Clara was already shaking her head, already reaching for Daniel. Because some doors close before we are ready to walk through them. And far across town, in room 14 at Fairview, Margaret Hale opened her eyes in the dark, as if she could feel the locket finally opening. Next to her bed sat a leather folder she had been guarding for 30 years, with one name written on it. The name of a lawyer, Thomas Reed. That night, the engagement dinner ended without an engagement. But Richard Whitmore did something he had not done in 30 years. He told the truth. He asked Clara and Daniel to stay, and in the empty dining hall, under the crystal chandelier, he began. "40 years ago, I had nothing," Richard said. "Just an idea and a partner. Her name was Margaret Hale. She was smarter than me. The patents that started this company, she wrote them. The first designs, hers. I was the salesman. She was the mind. We built it together for 10 years. And then the company got big. Investors came. And the investors told me something I was weak enough to listen to. They said a woman at the top would scare the market. They said, buy her out. Rewrite the history. Put your name on everything." So I did. He told them how it happened. And as he spoke, the story became a room 30 years in the past. A young Richard and a young Margaret in a cramped office above the hardware shop, celebrating their first big contract with cheap champagne and paper cups. Margaret had just designed the thing that would make them rich. She was laughing. She trusted him completely. "That was the last honest night we ever had," Richard said. "Because the investors came the next week. And they made me a promise that was really a poison. They said, a company like this needs one face, one name, yours." "There was a document," Richard went on. "A revaluation of her shares. 40 pages of legal language written to look boring, so no one would read the one clause in the middle that mattered. I gave it to our lawyer, a young man named Thomas Reed, and I told him to make the numbers work. Margaret signed it because she trusted me. She thought she was signing a growth plan. She was signing away her own life's work for the price of a used car. When she understood, she came to my office. She didn't scream. That was the worst part. She just took off the locket I'd given her, set it on my desk, and said one sentence. One day, Richard, someone is going to look at you the way I'm looking at you now, and you'll finally know what you are. She left the locket. But I couldn't throw it away. I kept it in a drawer for 30 years. And then, years later, when she was old and sick and living on nothing, I heard she'd been asking for it back. So I had it sent to her, anonymously, through the only person who still knew the whole story, Thomas Reed. What Richard didn't know was that Thomas Reed had carried that guilt for 30 years, too. Thomas had been young and ambitious once, and he had written the clause that erased a woman. He had spent the rest of his career quietly trying to make up for the one thing he could never undo. So when Thomas mailed Margaret her locket, he did one more thing Richard never authorized. He included the original, undoctored deed, the real one, the one that proved everything. And a note. In case you ever want the truth on paper, it said, it's yours. It always was. Margaret had hidden that deed inside the lining of her old coat and carried it into Fairview and told no one. She had been sitting on the truth for years, waiting, not for revenge, but for the right hands to give it to. And the right hands, it turned out, belonged to a nurse's aide who fed her lunch and never once asked her for anything. I had our lawyers value her share at almost nothing. I used a clause she trusted me enough not to read. In one afternoon, I took a company we built together and I made it mine. Margaret walked out with a locket and a photograph, and I told everyone I had founded it alone. Daniel stood up. You erased her. For 30 years, you let us believe a lie. And then Daniel understood something worse, and his voice dropped. That's why you wanted me to marry Sophia. It was never about her money. You needed the Vance investment to close Hale Tower before anyone found out the ground it stands on was stolen. You were going to sell my whole life to bury Margaret one more time. Richard could not meet his son's eyes. That was answer enough. I trusted you, Daniel said. I brought the woman I love into this house and let you humiliate her, because I believed, deep down, that my family were good people who just needed to get to know her. And the whole time, she was the only honest person at that table. Clara reached for his hand. Daniel, look at me. You are not him. You found out the truth, and the first thing you did was stand up. That is the whole difference between a good man and a guilty one. What you do in the first 10 seconds after you learn what you've been part of. Daniel looked at her, and in that moment he stopped being a Whitmore heir and started being someone Margaret Hale would have been proud to see Clara marry. I don't want any of it, Daniel said quietly to his father. The company, the name, the money. If it was built on erasing her, then I don't want to inherit it. I'd rather have nothing and be able to look at myself. Then you'll have nothing, Vivienne hissed from the doorway. Both of you. You'll see how romantic the truth feels when you're paying rent with it. We'll be fine, Clara said simply. I've had nothing my whole life. It turns out nothing, with the right person, is still more than you've ever had. Every year I sent money to her lawyer, anonymously, Richard said. She sent every check back, uncashed. She didn't want my guilt. She wanted her name. I named a building after her because I was too much of a coward to give her the truth. Clara had gone very still. The building, she said. Is it called Hale Tower? Richard looked up sharply. How do you know that name? From the doorway, Vivienne answered for her, her voice ice. Because Hale Tower closes in 2 days, Richard. And if this girl and her dying woman make one sound, one lawsuit, one headline, we lose everything. Do you understand? Everything. And there it was. The real fear under all the cruelty. Vivienne had never hated Clara. She had been terrified of exactly this moment since the day she married into a lie. Clara stood up. I need to go to her, she said. Margaret, if she has days, she needs to know this came out. She needs to know before... She couldn't finish. Daniel grabbed his keys. I'm driving you. You take one step out that door with her, Vivienne said, and you are no longer a Whitmore. No money, no name, nothing. Daniel looked at his mother for a long moment. Then he took Clara's hand, and they walked out the door. In the car, Daniel's hands were shaking on the wheel. My whole life was built on that, he said quietly. My school, this car, everything. It was all stolen from a woman dying in a room you clean. He had to pull over for a moment because he couldn't see the road. It's not your fault, Clara said. You were a child when it happened. You don't inherit a man's guilt. You only inherit the choice of what to do about it now that you know. Daniel looked at her. This girl his family had spent all night trying to destroy, comforting him about his own family's crime. And he understood, finally and completely, why Margaret had trusted her. Drive, she said gently. We can still make it. She should hear that the truth is out. She's waited long enough. Daniel drove. The streets blurred past, and with every mile, the mansion behind them felt less like home and more like a museum of a lie he had lived inside his entire life without ever knowing it. But they were already too late for the one thing that mattered most. Because while a family was tearing itself apart in a mansion across town, Margaret Hale had asked the night nurse for one favor: to call a number she had kept for 30 years. The number of Thomas Reed. Thomas Reed was the lawyer who had valued Margaret's share at nothing all those years ago, and had regretted it every single day since. When Clara and Daniel finally reached Fairview, the hallway lights were dimmed, and Thomas Reed was standing outside room 14, holding a thick leather folder against his chest. He looked at Clara's locket. He looked at her face. And he said the sentence that would end one empire and begin one long overdue justice. She's been waiting for you, he said. And she left everything, the deed, the original patents, the proof, to the only person who ever treated her like she mattered. She left it all to you, Clara. Clara went into room 14 alone. Margaret was very small in the bed now, but her eyes found Clara's locket, and she smiled. You opened it, Margaret whispered. No, Clara said, tears running now. He did. Richard Whitmore. Margaret, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know who you were. Margaret lifted one thin hand and touched Clara's cheek. That, she said, is exactly why I chose you. Everyone who ever knew who I was wanted something. You didn't know and you stayed anyway. Do you understand how rare that is? And here is the twist that the whole world would get wrong when the news broke. Everyone assumed Clara had to be Margaret's secret granddaughter, a lost heir, a blood connection that explained the locket. She wasn't. Clara Bennett was no one's lost daughter. She was just a poor girl who fed a lonely old woman lunch and listened to her stories when literally no one else on earth would. The locket didn't open because they shared blood. It opened because Margaret had finally found someone worth giving it to. Margaret closed her eyes. Don't use it for revenge, she said, so quietly Clara had to lean in. I spent 30 years wanting Richard to suffer. It never once made me warm at night. Use it for the truth. Just make them say my name. That's all I ever wanted. To be a name again, instead of a thing that was erased. Clara held her hand until the room went quiet. Margaret Hale died a few minutes after midnight, with the only family she had ever chosen sitting beside her, and her name finally about to be spoken out loud again. Clara sat with her a long time after she was gone. She didn't want Margaret to be alone, even now, even for the few minutes it would take for someone to come. 30 years of the world ignoring this woman, and Clara was determined that her last moments would not be one more. Daniel found her there at dawn, still holding a cold hand, the locket open on her chest. He didn't say anything. He just sat down on the other side of the bed and stayed with both of them. And in that quiet room, before the lawyers and the reporters and the collapse, Clara made Margaret a promise. Not to win, not to take, just to make the world say her name correctly, one time, out loud. The news did not wait for grief. By the next morning, Thomas Reed had filed the original partnership deed with the court. And Hale Tower, the deal that was going to save the Whitmores, stopped cold. The hearing was 3 days later. Clara had never been inside a courtroom. She wore her plain blue dress again, the same one they had mocked at the dinner, and the locket. And she sat in the front row while 30 years of buried truth were read out loud. Thomas Reed took the stand himself. He did not defend anyone. He did the opposite. 30 years ago, he told the court, I helped a powerful man steal a company from the woman who built it. I wrote the clause that erased her. I have waited 3 decades for the chance to correct it. This deed is genuine. I witnessed the original, and every word of it is true. Whitmore Holdings sent a wall of expensive lawyers to fight it. They argued technicalities. They questioned Margaret's mental state. They even suggested Clara had forged the whole thing. But you cannot cross-examine a photograph inside a locket that only 2 living people knew how to open. And one of them was the man being accused. When the judge asked Richard Whitmore, under oath, whether the deed was real, the entire courtroom held its breath. Richard could have lied one more time. His lawyers were begging him to. Instead, the old man stood up, looked at the empty seat where Margaret should have been, and said one word. Yes. It was the first brave thing Richard Whitmore had done in 30 years. And it cost him everything he owned. He seemed almost relieved to finally be rid of it. The judge ruled that afternoon. The Hale share was real. It had always been real, and it now belonged in full to the person Margaret Hale had named in a will witnessed by Thomas Reed 3 weeks before she died. Sophia Vance's father read 1 page of that deed and pulled his investment in an hour. I don't build towers on stolen ground, he said. The other investors followed like dominoes. By the end of the week, the Whitmore fortune, the marble, the mansion, the name that had humiliated a girl at a dinner table, was gone. It happened faster than anyone believed possible. That is how these things always go. Slowly for 30 years, and then all at once. The story hit the news with a headline nobody in that family could survive. Billionaire built empire on erased partner. Proof found in dying woman's locket. Reporters camped outside the mansion. The board of Whitmore Holdings called an emergency vote and removed Richard by lunchtime. The men who had once told him to erase Margaret were the first to erase him. Sophia Vance stopped answering Daniel's family entirely. There is no faster cure for a marriage of convenience than the sudden absence of convenience. Her father's lawyers made sure the Vance name was nowhere near the wreckage. And Ashley, the sister with the sharp tongue, did something no one expected. She packed a bag, left the collapsing mansion, and showed up at Clara's tiny apartment with red eyes. I laughed at you, she said. At that dinner, I laughed. I need you to know I've never been more ashamed of anything in my life. Clara let her in. Of course she did. That was who Clara was. She made the girl who had mocked her a cup of tea, and they sat together while a dynasty burned on the television in the corner. The mansion went up for sale. The cars were repossessed. Vivian Whitmore, who had once offered $50,000 like it was pocket change, learned what it felt like to have her own credit cards declined in a grocery store. Vivian screamed at lawyers. She threatened. She begged. But you cannot sue your way out of a truth that is finally, simply true. And Clara Bennett, the nurse's aide with no name and no people, now legally held half of everything the Whitmores had ever owned. The story went everywhere. And here is where the world got the twist wrong, exactly the way Margaret had known it would. Every headline assumed there had to be a blood connection. Secret heir found. Billionaire's hidden granddaughter. The internet decided Clara had to be Margaret's long-lost family, because the world cannot imagine a person doing something kind for a stranger without a reason. But Clara corrected them, every single time. In every interview, she said the same thing. I am not her granddaughter. I am not her heir. I was nobody to her, and she was nobody to the world. I just sat with her. That's the whole story. That's all it ever takes. That was the sentence that made the story go from famous to unforgettable. Because a lost heir is a fairy tale, but a poor stranger who was simply kind and was rewarded for it by accident. That is a mirror. And it made a lot of comfortable people very uncomfortable. Vivian came to her one last time. No black car now, no envelope. Just a woman in an unpaid-for coat, standing in the rain outside a care home. "So this is your revenge," she said bitterly. And what Clara said next was the thing Vivian would think about for the rest of her life. "It's not revenge," Clara said. "Margaret asked me not to make you suffer, so I'm not going to. But I'm not going to protect you from the truth either. There's a difference. You should learn it." "You think you're better than me," Vivian said, the rain running down her face. "You think a poor girl with a kind heart is worth more than everything I built my life around." "I don't think I'm better than you," Clara said. "I think you spent your whole life afraid of becoming me, poor and nobody. And that fear made you cruel. I feel sorry for you, Vivian. That's the truth. I actually feel sorry for you." And that, not the money, not the mansion, not the headlines, was the thing that finally broke Vivian Whitmore. Because pity from someone she had called worthless was a mirror she could not look away from. She turned and walked into the rain without another word. Some people, when they lose everything, finally look inward and change. Vivian was not one of them. She would spend the rest of her life certain she was the victim of the story. And maybe that was the loneliest ending of all. Before any of that, there was a funeral. Margaret had told Clara once that she expected to be buried by the county, in the section of the cemetery with the numbered markers and no names. It was what happened to people no one claimed. Clara would not allow it. She used the very first thing she could access to give Margaret a real funeral, a headstone with her full name, her real title carved beneath it. Margaret Hale, builder, founder. She made things that lasted. Almost no one should have come. She had no family, after all. But the story had spread, and so the little chapel filled, with nurses from Fairview, with residents in wheelchairs, with strangers who had read about her and simply wanted to stand for a woman who had been made to stand alone for 30 years. Richard came too. He sat in the very back row, in a plain coat, and he wept the way men weep when they have finally understood something 30 years too late. No one asked him to leave. Margaret, Clara thought, would have wanted him to see it, to see the room full of people that her kindness had earned, and his money never could. At the end, Clara stood up and said 6 words that became the whole point of everything that followed. She was worth being seen, finally. Clara did not keep the fortune. That surprised everyone. The lawyers, the reporters, even Daniel. She kept exactly what Margaret's original share had been worth, honestly valued. Enough to be comfortable, never to be cruel. The rest she put into something she named without hesitation. The Margaret Hale Foundation. For elderly people with no one left to visit them. Hale Tower was finished, but not as luxury apartments. It reopened as a care center, a good one, with sunlight and gardens and staff who were paid enough to stay. Over the entrance, in tall bronze letters, was the name the family had spent 30 years erasing. Margaret Hale. Richard came to the opening. He was much poorer now, and somehow he stood straighter than he ever had in his mansion. He read the name over the door for a long time. "Calm, Clara, for making me a smaller man. I should have been one all along." Richard asked Clara for one thing. Not forgiveness. He said he had no right to that. He asked if he could volunteer at the center. Sit with the residents who had no visitors. Read to them. Be, for once in his life, useful to people who could give him absolutely nothing back. Clara said yes. Because Margaret had not raised her, but Margaret had taught her. And the last lesson was the hardest one. You do not have to destroy a man to defeat what was worst in him. Sometimes you defeat it by handing him a better way to live. Ashley started working at the center full-time. The girl who once mocked a nurse's aide became one. She was not good at it at first. She dropped things and said the wrong words. But she showed up every day. And the old people, who forgive more easily than the young, made room for her. Vivian never came. She moved to a small apartment in another city and told everyone she met a version of the story where she was the victim. Some people believed her. That was her whole punishment in the end. Not poverty, but the small, endless work of lying to herself forever. One gray morning, months later, Clara found Richard standing alone at Margaret's grave. He had brought no cameras, no reporters, no one to see him do it. He was just an old man in a plain coat, talking quietly to a headstone. Clara didn't interrupt, but she heard the one sentence he said before he left. "You were right," Richard told the grave. "Someone finally looked at me the way you did. And now I know what I am. I'm sorry it took me a whole life to find out." That is what real justice looked like in the end. Not a man in handcuffs, a man at a grave, finally telling the truth to the one person who could no longer hear it, and choosing to become someone who would never need to say sorry like that again. And Daniel? Daniel had walked out of that mansion with nothing but his car keys and the woman he loved. He never once looked back. They did get married. Eventually. Not in a grand hall in front of 200 judging strangers. In the garden of the Margaret Hale Center, in front of the old people Clara took care of, who cried and clapped and said it was the finest wedding they had ever seen. It was a small wedding. There was no orchestra, no ice sculpture, no guest list vetted for status. There were folding chairs on the grass, paper lanterns in the trees, and a cake one of the residents had insisted on baking with her shaking hands. Daniel wore a suit that no longer came from a fortune. Clara wore a simple white dress and the silver locket. And when the old man who used to be a billionaire was asked to give a reading, Richard Whitmore stood up with shaking hands and read a poem about second chances to a garden full of people the world had thrown away. Halfway through the ceremony, Clara looked at the empty chair they had left in the front row. On it sat a single framed photograph, the faded one from inside the locket, of a laughing young woman in front of a hardware shop. Margaret had a seat at the wedding after all. She had a front row seat to a family, at last. When Daniel kissed his bride, the loudest cheer came from a row of wheelchairs and walkers. Clara laughed and cried at the same time, and somewhere in that sound was every lonely night she had ever spent, believing she belonged to no one. 1 year later, the Margaret Hale Center had a waiting list, and 2 more were being built. Other cities called Clara, asking how she had done it. She always gave the same answer. "I didn't do anything special," she said. "I just treated a forgotten person like she still counted." Anyone can do that. Most people just don't. Clara wore the locket. She always wore the locket. Thomas Reed, the lawyer who had helped erase Margaret and then spent 30 years trying to undo it, retired the month the center opened. He asked for only one thing in return for everything he had done: to be allowed to volunteer at the front desk, greeting the people who came to visit. He said it was the first honest job he'd had in decades. And Margaret Hale, the woman the world had spent 30 years erasing, now had her name on a building, on a foundation, on the lips of every person who walked through those doors, looking for a little dignity at the end of their lives. She got her name back. It just came too late for her to hear it, and exactly in time to change everything that came after. So, back to the question from the very beginning. That dinner table, where a rich family mocked a poor bride for having no name, no money, and no people. They were right about one thing. Clara had no money and no family. But they were wrong about what that meant. Because the poorest person at that table turned out to be the only one who had ever given something to a human being, expecting nothing back. Margaret spent her last 30 years learning that being important is not the same as being good. And Clara never had to learn it, because she had never once confused the two. A person should not have to prove they are a CEO's daughter, a billionaire's heir, or the owner of a valuable locket before the world decides they deserve kindness. Dignity is not a prize you win by being useful to powerful people. It is where every honest life is supposed to begin. So the next time the world laughs at someone for their cheap clothes or their empty hands, remember Clara Bennett. Remember that the person everyone looks down on might be the only one in the room who is actually worth looking up to. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments, who was really the poorest person at that dinner table? And if you believe kindness should never need a receipt, subscribe and stay for the next story.